December 23, 1944. A 20-year-old replacement from Scranton, Pennsylvania, is standing on a frozen road in Luxembourg with an empty coffee pot in both hands. The pot is dented black. Ice has formed around the lip. It was built to carry enough coffee for a rifle squad. Right now, it carries nothing. Behind him sits a field kitchen trailer, loaded with canned beef, powdered potatoes, and sacks of coffee that have not touched boiling water in almost 3 days. In front of him, a narrow road runs north through the pines toward Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne is surrounded and waiting for help. Every truck on that road has been told the same thing: ammunition first, fuel second. Everything else waits. The boy does not know the staff car sliding to a stop behind the convoy belongs to General George S. Patton. He does not know the man stepping out into the ice has been awake since before dawn, and in some deeper way has been awake since the Germans broke through the Ardennes 1 week earlier. He does not know that in 60 seconds, Patton will look at the pot in his hands and ask one question: who is that for? And in 4 hours, that question will erase a line on a routing board, put 6 kitchens back onto the forward roads, and send the first hot coffee into foxholes where men had started to believe the army had forgotten they were human. 50 years later, in a little Pennsylvania kitchen, that same soldier will still wake before sunrise on the first hard, cold morning of December and put a pot of coffee on the stove. Not because he needs coffee. Because once, in the worst winter of his life, an empty pot made a general angry. Southern Luxembourg. The sky is the color of dirty wool. Snow lies in old layers along both sides of the road, packed down by tank tracks, boot prints, mule hooves, and the tires of trucks that should never have been asked to climb those hills in winter. The road is not really a road anymore. It is a strip of ice pretending to be a road. A convoy has stopped at the edge of a small village, whose name most of the men cannot pronounce. 3 deuce-and-a-half trucks, 1 fuel tender, 1 kitchen trailer, 1 Jeep with a cracked windshield, and a driver who keeps hitting the starter, as if the engine might feel sorry for him. The men are not moving quickly. That is what Patton sees first. Not fear, not panic, not cowardice. Slowness. And slowness, in December of 1944, is sometimes the first visible symptom of a system bleeding internally. Patton is in the front passenger seat of the staff car with a map folded across his knees. The map has pencil marks running north like scratches, arrows, road numbers. Unit boundaries changed so many times the paper looks bruised. 4 days earlier, in a conference room at Verdun, Patton had told Eisenhower he could turn the 3rd United States Army 90 degrees north and attack the southern flank of the German offensive within 72 hours. Some men in that room thought he was boasting. Then they realized he had already planned it. The 3rd Army pivoted. Whole divisions turned in winter darkness. Columns that had been facing east toward Germany swung north toward Luxembourg and Belgium. The movement was so fast that military historians would later call it one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. But speed has a shadow. The tanks turn, the guns turn, the maps turn, the orders turn, and somewhere behind all that movement, kitchens do not turn as quickly. That is the part no one paints on a monument. Patton opens the car door. The cold hits him hard enough to take the breath out of a younger man. He is 59 years old. His helmet carries 3 stars larger than regulation. His coat is buttoned tight. On his hip is the revolver everyone notices and almost nobody understands. He walks toward the stalled convoy. The drivers see him one by one. A private drops a wrench. A corporal straightens so fast his boots slide. The Jeep driver stops hitting the starter. Patton says nothing. He walks past the first truck, past the fuel tender, past a stack of ration crates tied down under frozen canvas. Then he sees the boy with the coffee pot. The boy is not sitting. He is standing because if he sits down, he is afraid he will not get back up. He has a wool cap under his helmet. His eyes are red from wind and sleeplessness. His gloves are too thin, and the fingers have gone dark at the seams where the cloth is frozen stiff. Patton points at the pot. "Who is that for?" The boy looks down, as if he has forgotten he is holding it. "Company C, sir." "Is there coffee in it?" "No, sir." "Was there supposed to be?" The boy swallows. "Yes, sir." The wind moves through the trees. Somewhere farther north, artillery funks so far away it sounds like a door closing in another house. Patton looks at the kitchen trailer. When did Company C last get anything hot? The boy tries to answer quickly, but the arithmetic is not quick anymore. Cold slows arithmetic. Hunger slows memory. "Not sure, sir." "Try." Morning of the 20th, I think. Patton turns his head a little. "The 20th. Yes, sir. Maybe night of the 19th. What have they been eating?" "K rations, sir. Cold when we can open them." "When you can open them." The boy says nothing. Patton looks at his hands. He can see why opening a ration box would be a problem. The knuckles are split. One thumbnail is black. The skin at the wrists has that gray, waxed look that comes before frostbite stops being a warning and becomes a fact. "Why are you standing here with an empty pot?" The boy looks toward the kitchen trailer. "Mess sergeant told me if the trailer got cleared through, I was to ride it forward." "Cleared through by whom?" "I don't know, sir." "Who told the trailer to stop?" "I don't know that either, sir." The answer is not insolent. It is worse than insolent. It is honest. The boy is holding the bottom of a system in both hands, and nobody has told him where the top is. Patton looks at the pot one more time. Then he says very quietly, "Get in the car." The boy freezes. "Sir." "Not my car. The Jeep. You are going to show me who owns that kitchen." The Jeep driver finally finds his engine. It coughs, catches, and spits blue smoke into the cold. Patton turns to his aide. "Find the nearest supply control point." The aide already has a finger on the map. "Old schoolhouse, sir, half a mile ahead." "Then we are going to school." The schoolhouse had been built for children who were now either hiding in cellars or walking west with what they could carry. It is 2 stories of stone, with tall windows boarded from the inside, and a cracked bell still hanging in a little tower above the roof. Someone has painted a red cross on one door and an arrow on another. Neither arrow points to anything permanent. Nothing in that week points to anything permanent. Inside, the main classroom has become a routing office. The blackboard is still on the wall. Under a half-erased French lesson, someone has drawn a road grid in chalk. Colored paper slips are pinned beside it. Red for ammunition, yellow for fuel, blue for medical, white for rations. There are too many white slips. That is the first thing Patton sees. The second thing he sees is that most of them have been pushed to the edge of the board. A captain named Ellis stands at a table made from 2 school desks. He is 32 years old. He has not taken his boots off in 4 days. He has a clipboard in one hand, a pencil behind his ear, and a cup of coffee near his elbow that is still giving off steam. He is not a bad officer. That matters. If he were lazy, this would be easier. If he were cruel, Patton could understand it. If he were drunk or frightened or hiding, the army had names for those failures and punishments to match them. But Captain Ellis is not drunk. He is not hiding. He is not cruel. He is busy. And busy men can do terrible damage when they begin to believe that a stack of paper is more real than the men at the end of the road. When Patton walks in, Every man in the room stands. The boy from Scranton remains near the door with the empty coffee pot in both hands. Patton does not return the salutes right away. He looks at the board. Who controls kitchen movement through this sector? Ellis takes half a step forward. I do, sir. Patton points to the pot. Then explain that. Ellis looks at the boy, then at the pot, then at the board. Sir, ration movements have been delayed by road priority. We have ammunition and fuel traffic moving north. The kitchen trailers are waiting for clearance. How long? Some since yesterday morning. The boy at the door does not move. Patton's eyes stay on Ellis. That one. Ellis turns to a corporal at the board. Find Company C kitchen request. The corporal starts pulling white slips from a cluster near the lower edge. One falls to the floor. Another sticks to his glove because the paper has gone damp. He finds the slip, reads it, and then does not hand it over. That tiny pause is enough. Patton says, read it. The corporal reads, forward kitchen trailer halted south of village due to road closure. Alternate track through engineer lane requested. Hot food not delivered since morning 20th. Company unable to heat rations under current position. Request immediate movement authority. The room has gone still. Patton says, date. December 21st, sir. Time. 0800. Patton looks at the window. Outside, the afternoon light is already failing. That was yesterday morning. No one answers. Why is it still on the board? Ellis says, sir, the engineer lane is inside another movement boundary. I needed confirmation before rerouting non-essential traffic. Non-essential. Ellis hears the word as soon as Patton repeats it. He hears what he has said. He has called hot food non-essential in front of a general who has spent his entire life believing that armies do not move on speeches. They move on fuel, steel, discipline, fear, pride, maps, profanity, luck, and food. Patton takes the white slip from the corporal and reads it himself. 1 page, 4 lines. A request nobody had meant to ignore. A kitchen that could move if someone with authority stopped treating food as a courtesy. A company of riflemen who had been holding a frozen ridge on cold tins and melted snow because the word routine had been placed between their hunger and the men who could solve it. Patton sets the slip on the table beside the captain's coffee. Then he asks, whose cup is that? Ellis looks at the coffee. Mine, sir. Is it hot? Ellis does not answer. Patton picks it up. He does not drink from it. He holds it for a moment, feeling the warmth through the metal. Then he places the empty pot next to it. There are moments in a war when a whole room understands something before anyone says it. This is one of those moments. Hot coffee on the desk, empty pot at the door. The entire failure is visible. Patton speaks softly. Captain, I have seen men fail because they were afraid. I have seen men fail because they were stupid. I have even seen men fail because they were unlucky. He taps the white slip. But this is another kind of failure. He looks around the room now, not just at Ellis. This is the failure of distance. A man in a warm room begins to believe that the front is a line on a board. He forgets that the line has teeth. He forgets that paper is not paper when a hungry man is waiting at the other end of it. No one moves. Patton turns back to Ellis. Where is the mess sergeant who wrote this? With the trailer, sir. Bring him. 14 minutes later, Staff Sergeant Rafael Morales walks into the schoolhouse with snow on his shoulders and black grease under both thumbnails. He is 36 years old. Before the war, he ran the breakfast counter in a rail station outside San Antonio. He knows how to cook for men who have 5 minutes, numb hands, and no patience. He knows coffee is not a luxury at the front. It is heat you can swallow. He comes to attention. Patton says, at ease, tell me how to get your kitchen forward. Morales does not ask for the question to be repeated. He has been carrying the answer all day. There is an engineered track east of the crossroads, sir. Soft shoulder for 50 yards, but passable if we chain the trailer. It comes out behind a burned barn, then follows the stone wall north. It avoids the shelled junction. Why are you not using it? Boundary restriction, sir. Different traffic control. Can you make it? Yes, sir. Can you make it before dark? Morales glances at the windows. With 2 trucks and 1 jeep in front to break ice. Yes, sir. How much food? Coffee first, then stew, then more coffee. I can feed 1 company hot within 2 hours, 2 more before midnight if the road holds. Patton nods once. That is all he needed. Not a speech, not a theory. A route, a time, and a man who knew what he was talking about. Patton turns to the chalkboard. Erase the boundary. Ellis looks at him. Sir, the boundary. Erase it. A lieutenant steps forward and wipes a line off the board with the sleeve of his coat. Chalk dust hangs in the cold air. Patton points to the white ration slips. From this minute, forward feeding requests in this army are combat traffic. You will move kitchens as if they carry ammunition, because a rifle company that cannot feel its hands cannot hold a rifle for long. He turns to Ellis. No ration report waits behind fuel, unless fuel is what will keep the ration from moving. No kitchen request is routine if the men forward have gone more than 24 hours without something hot. And no officer in this room will ever again use the word non-essential for the only warm thing a boy may touch all week. Ellis stands very still. Yes, sir. Patton picks up the captain's coffee and pours it into the empty pot. Not enough to fill it. Not enough to matter. Enough for everyone to see what the pot was made for. Sergeant Morales. Sir. Move. Morales takes the pot, salutes, and goes out the door so fast the boy from Scranton has to step aside. Patton looks at the boy. What is your name? Miller, sir. Private Miller, you will ride with that kitchen. Yes, sir. And when it gets there, you will hand the first cup to the man farthest forward. Miller nods. His face does not change, but his hands tighten around nothing. He has given the pot away. For the first time all day, he is not carrying the failure. Someone else is. To understand why that order mattered, you have to understand what December did to the Third Army. The official maps make the pivot look clean. An arrow turns north. A division moves here. A corps shifts there. A spearhead pushes toward Bastogne. Maps are polite. They do not show what the movement cost. They do not show the truck driver who kept his foot on the clutch until his leg shook so badly he had to beat it with his fist. They do not show the infantryman trying to light a cigarette with matches so damp they broke apart in his fingers. They do not show the cook standing beside a cold stove with food close enough to smell and men too far away to feed. The Germans had opened the Ardennes offensive on December 16th. By the 20th, Bastogne was encircled. On the 22nd, General Anthony McAuliffe answered a German surrender demand with one word: nuts. That word would become famous, but fame does not make a foxhole warmer. While newspapers would later remember the word, men in the trees remembered other things: the taste of cold crackers, the sound of the canned key snapping, the way snow packed into the seam of a boot, the shame of wanting food more badly than sleep, the strange quiet that comes over men when they have stopped expecting help from behind them. That was the danger Patton understood, even if he would never have described it gently. An army can survive hunger for a time. It can survive cold for a time. It can survive confusion, bad roads, and enemy fire. But when hunger, cold, and confusion begin to feel like neglect. Something inside a soldier changes. He may still obey. He may still fire. He may still move when ordered. But a thin thread has been cut. And sometimes that thread is the difference between holding one more hour and breaking 1 hour too soon. That afternoon, the thread was tied to an empty coffee pot. The first truck moved at 15:10 hours. Not officially because a great decision had been made. Not in any way that would make a line in a published diary. Not with trumpet music or a photographer present. A jeep went first, tires hunting for grip on the frozen track. Behind it came a deuce and a half loaded with insulated cans. Behind that, the kitchen trailer with Morales riding the step and shouting at the driver every time the wheels drifted too close to the ditch. Private Miller rode in the back beside 2 cans of coffee and 1 can of stew. The metal gave off heat through the blankets wrapped around it. He kept one hand on the lid, as if someone might take it away if he stopped touching it. They passed the shelled junction where the old route had died. One truck lay there on its side, blackened, with snow collecting inside the cab. A signpost had been cut in half by shrapnel. The road beyond it was pocked and empty. Morales had been right. The alternate track was ugly but passable. It ran behind a burned barn, over a culvert half-packed with ice, then along a stone wall where branches scraped the canvas and made every man duck even though the branches could not hurt them. The war could. The branches were only noise. At 16:25, the convoy reached the tree line where Company C was dug in. By then the sun had already left the valley. It was not dark yet, but the day had given up. Men heard the engines before they saw the trucks. At first no one believed it was food. Trucks meant ammunition. Trucks meant wounded men going out. Trucks meant orders. Trucks meant something else would be demanded from you. Then the smell came through the trees. Coffee first. Not strong coffee. Not good coffee. Army coffee. Burned at the edge, thin in the middle, black as a rifle bore. It was the best smell any of them had ever known. A corporal lifted his head from a foxhole and said something no one later remembered. Another man laughed, but it came out wrong, like a cough. Someone called for mess tins. Someone else started cursing because he could not get his gloves off. Miller climbed down with the pot. His legs almost folded under him when his boots hit the snow. Morales was already at the back of the truck, pulling the lid off the first can. Steam rose into the cold and became visible. That was the moment the line formed. Not because anyone ordered it, because steam is an order of its own. Men came out of holes in the ground with blankets over their shoulders, rifles still hanging from their arms, faces gray with cold and beard stubble. Some looked embarrassed to be there. Some looked angry. Some looked so tired they did not seem to recognize the truck until they were standing in front of it. Morales filled the pot. Then he handed it to Miller. "Farthest forward," he said. Miller walked past the line. Men watched him go, and nobody argued. Maybe they understood. Maybe they were too tired. Maybe some messages do not need to be explained. At the forward foxhole, a sergeant named Walsh was lying under a shelter half with one boot off and his rifle across his chest. He had not taken the boot off because he wanted to. He had taken it off because 2 toes had gone white, and the medic had told him that if he wanted to keep them, he needed to warm them before the night finished the job. Miller crouched beside him. "Coffee, Sergeant." Walsh opened his eyes. For a second he did not understand the words. Then Miller put the cup into his hands. The sergeant wrapped both palms around it. The heat hit his fingers, and pain came with it. Real pain. Living pain. The kind that means the body has not quit. Walsh lowered his head over the cup. He did not drink right away. He breathed it in. That was all. 50 yards behind him, men were receiving stew in tins and coffee in canteen cups, and one spoon shared between 3 men because 2 of them had lost theirs, and nobody cared anymore. The stew was too salty. The coffee was burned. The bread was hard at the edges. Every man there would have fought another man for it if he had to. But he did not have to. For once, something had arrived before the breaking point. Miller went back for more. He carried coffee until his shoulders shook. He carried stew until the sleeves of his coat were wet with steam. He spilled some and cursed like an old soldier, which made Morales laugh for the first time in 3 days. Somewhere in the dark behind them, artillery started again. Nobody stopped eating. That is how you know the food mattered. Not because it ended the battle. It did not. Not because it saved everyone. It did not. Not because it turned Patton into a saint. It certainly did not. It mattered because for 20 minutes on a frozen ridge in Luxembourg, men who had been treated by distance as marks on a map were treated again as bodies with blood in them. Warmth entered the line by the cupful, and the line held through the night. 4 days later, on December 26th, tanks from the 4th Armored Division broke into Bastogne. The moment belongs to history. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. The road near Assinoy. The Sherman tanks pushing through. The men of the 101st watching the relief column arrive after days inside the ring. That is the scene the books remember. Patton wrote that the relief of Bastogne was one of the finest operations of the war. He was right to be proud. The pivot had been extraordinary. The roads had been impossible. The timing had been brutal. The Germans had been hit from an angle they could not ignore. But that is the problem with great operations. They are so large that they swallow the small ones. The staff car stopping behind a stalled kitchen trailer does not survive well beside the relief of Bastogne. A routing boundary erased from a chalkboard does not sound like history when tanks are breaking through enemy lines. A private from Scranton carrying burned coffee to a half-frozen sergeant will never compete with a famous one-word answer to a surrender demand. But a man does not live his life inside history. He lives it inside the moments that reached him. For Private Miller, the war did not divide itself neatly into campaigns. It divided itself into before the pot and after the pot. Before the pot, he believed the army was a machine so large that no one could hear him inside it. After the pot, he understood something more complicated. The army was still a machine. It was still too large. It still made mistakes that crushed men who had no say in them. But once in a while, if the right person saw the right failure at the right second, the machine could be forced to remember what it was carrying. Not supplies, not symbols, not arrows on a board. Men. Miller survived the Bulge. He survived January, when the snow got old and the dead were found under it. He survived the roads into Germany. He survived the last strange weeks of the war, when everyone knew the end was coming, and men still died anyway. He came home in the autumn of 1945, carrying a duffel bag, a winter cough, and a silence his family mistook for strength, because nobody had taught them another word for it. He went back to Pennsylvania. For a while he worked nights loading mail. Later he ran the counter at a bus station diner because he liked early mornings, and because men coming off night buses looked the way soldiers looked when they needed someone to put something hot in front of them without asking too many questions. He married a woman named Helen. They had 2 daughters and a son. He did not tell them much about the war. When the girls asked if he had been scared, he said everybody was scared. When his son asked if he had met Patton, he said, once, from a distance. That was all. But every December, when the first real cold settled on the windows and the house made that little cracking sound old houses make before dawn, Miller woke early. Not at 7, not at 6, before sunrise. He went downstairs in his robe, moved carefully because his toes had never fully forgiven him, and filled a coffee pot. He did not use an electric percolator after Helen bought one. He kept the old stove pot, black, dented, stubborn. He set it on the back burner and waited for the first steam. Sometimes Helen came down and found him sitting alone at the kitchen table in the dark. No newspaper, no radio, no lights except the stove flame. Just a man watching steam rise. The first time she asked, he gave the kind of answer men gave when the truth was too large and too small at the same time. "Cold morning," he said. Years later, after their children were grown, she asked again. This time, he said, "There was a day over there when coffee came before we did." Helen waited. He rubbed his hands together as if they still hurt. Somebody noticed the pot was empty. That was the whole confession. She never asked for more. She did not need to. General Patton died on December 21st, 1945, 1 year after the winter that made his name larger and left so many smaller names buried under it. A low-speed truck collision near Mannheim broke his neck. He lived 12 days in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, paralyzed and fully conscious, and said more than once that it was a hell of a way to die. He was buried in Luxembourg, among the men of his Third Army. When people visit his grave, they often look for the general first. That is natural. History teaches the eye where to go, but the rows around him matter more than the stone at the front. Thousands of white crosses and stars of David, tankers, riflemen, engineers, cooks, drivers, clerks, medics, men who made the famous roads possible, and men who died on roads nobody can name. Some of them never received the hot food that came too late for other positions that night. Some of them never got a December morning in a warm kitchen. That is the part that should keep the story honest. One rerouted kitchen did not redeem the war. One angry general did not fix the machine. One pot of coffee did not change what the Bulge was, but it changed the day for men who had almost been lost inside the paperwork. And sometimes the human measure of a thing is not whether it changed history. Sometimes the measure is whether it reached one man before the coal did. The official record will always remember the big motion, the pivot north, the trap city, the tanks at Bastogne, the general with 3 stars and a grave at the head of the rows. But somewhere under that record is another truth, smaller and harder to file. A boy stood on a winter road with an empty pot. A general asked who it was for. A captain learned that routine is a dangerous word when hungry men are waiting. A cook knew the road before anyone gave him permission to use it. And a rifle company, gray-faced and silent in the trees, felt steam rise into the dark and understood that somebody behind the lines had remembered them. That is why, for 50 winters after the guns went quiet, an old man in Pennsylvania woke before dawn when the weather turned sharp and put coffee on the stove. He was not trying to remember the war. He was trying to remember the moment the war remembered him. The road froze. The order changed. The pot filled. And the line held.